I'm going to be talking about US history, and this topic is going to be more about a political science topic, so like globalization. And I want to focus on how it affects the USA specifically. And this video is courtesy of Boundless Lumen Learning. It's a really great resource, and it covers pretty much everything that I haven't covered in this video, so bear with me here. So to introduce globalization, if you've never heard of it before, here's a mini introduction. And if you have heard of it before and feel, comfortable with the topic, I would skip ahead to one of the later parts of this video. So globalization is a global interchanging of four major things. The first one is worldviews. So worldviews such as democracy, communism, liberalism, capitalism. So these are ideologies that can be spread from country to country. Second one is products. So I think this is the one we think of the most, such as like iPhones going from the United States to South America or Africa, computers, cars, plastics, all these different tangible things that you can actually touch and produce. Third is ideas. So this one's kind of related to worldviews, but the idea of a global education, a government, economic ideas. These are more abstract terms, whereas worldviews are more specific. Fourth one is cultures. So foods, languages, clothing, these sort of things that haven't necessarily been in one country before. For example, the United States having tacos. The tacos isn't, something inherent to the United States, but it's been imported through globalization. So what causes globalization? How does it happen? The first one, the first reason why globalization occurs is transportation. So back in the day, back in the older days, locomotives, basically trains, and steamships were the major forms of transportation that brought people from place to place and spread the ideas. Jet engines have replaced them, so airplanes are what you would consider now the transportation aspect of globalization. Second one is telecommunications. This one is extremely important. The telegraph was the first form of this, or one of the first forms of this, but the internet grew to replace it, and now the internet is connected to literally every single aspect of, I would say, American culture or American life, and most other countries, use the internet as well. There's very few countries that don't have access to the internet or are kind of excluded from it. And the third big one is trade. So this is the actual exchange of products and exchange of ideas and inventions. It's hard to see trade happen without the first two. So I think they kind of rely on each other and vice versa. So transportation and telecommunications kind of go together, and then trade is the one that kind of stands on its own. So I want to give a miniature history of globalization. This is not a new phenomenon. So around 3000 BCE, there was exchange of certain ideas on smaller scales with less rapid diffusion. So this exchange of globalization was going on. There was trading, that sort of stuff. Also, there's someone lawn mowing right outside my window, so I do apologize for that. But I'll try to speak clearly. So, for example, like ancient Egypt, ancient Persia, Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, we're seeing that sort of trade via ships, other things like that. Then into the 1500s, in the Common Era, so closer to present day, we're seeing triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And triangular trade was not, don't think of it as all good, although it transported crops, inventions. It also transported slaves and some not so savory ideas such as colonization. Around the 1800s, globalization reached global heights, connecting almost every population. So this is due primarily to colonization. So Britain had connected, Canada, India, large parts of Africa, some parts of South America, Australia. So Britain was a huge player in this. France was also doing the same thing. The Ottoman Empire was existing at this time and occupied most of the Middle East and North Africa. So by the 1800s, it was a global phenomenon. Then in the 1900s and 2000s, economies are becoming globally intertwined on a globalized scale. So now we're seeing more economic reliance on each other. For example, China and the US rely on each other economically. It's not just the US relying on China or vice versa, they both rely on each other. So now I want to get into more of the specifics of things we can specifically see caused by globalization. So the first big one I want to talk about is the International Monetary Fund. So the IMF, which is International Monetary Fund, developed economic definition of globalization in 2000, consisting of 4 parts. So the IMF is a result of globalization, and they're also trying to define globalization. So it's kind of funny. So the first aspect of economic globalization was trade and transactions. For example, China trades apples in exchange for US made oranges. I know this is kind of a simplified thing, but this sort of stuff does happen. Second one is capital and investment movements. So, for example, France might invest, $10 million in an Albanian glass company. Obviously, they would probably expect returns, but it's still an act of one country investing in another. Third is migration and human movement. So refugees from Somalia enter Kenya due to warfare, and obviously because huge amounts of people from Somalia are entering Kenya, it changes Kenya's economy. Fourth is dissemination of knowledge. So Russian-based agricultural invention spreads to Turkey via the internet. So I made that one up, but I'm sure something like this has happened. Maybe not Russia and Turkey, but you know what I mean. Alright, so the economy isn't the only thing being globalized. The environment has been globalized. I know this is a hot topic today. I think it's super interesting. So how is the environment affected by globalization? I kind of want to answer this question a little bit. Obviously, this isn't, a whole lecture on environmental globalization, but it's a good intro. So carbon emissions. So factories across the globe release carbon into the air, creating the potential for global warming to increase. So just because a factory in China exists, it doesn't mean that this doesn't affect all the other countries, because, if one country emits carbon, then it affects the entire globe because it makes the globe hotter. Second thing I want to talk about is international pollution. So air and water pollution can spread from other countries' borders to damage other nations. To give an example, maybe Germany had, an oil spill, and the oil went down a river and flowed into Switzerland. So something from Germany affected Switzerland, and this is due to globalization because, the environment is a part of the globe. Last one I want to talk about is overfishing. So this isn't something we talk about as much, but it's super, super important. A large part of the globe is unregulated in fishing, or the regulation that does exist is either limited or not really enforced as well as it could be. So oceans are the main thing being overfished, and one nation can overfish and, damage the food supply for other countries. For example, I know this does happen. Japan and Norway are huge, whalers, and they have decimated the whale population, which has damaged, global environmental ecosystems. And it's not just the environment and the economy being affected by globalization. We can see, political globalization. So the ideas of political, like governments, like communism spreading, democracy spreading, socialism spreading, same thing. All of those going across the globe. That's political globalization. Intellectual globalization, so the idea of education being spreaded, American universities, British universities, Chinese universities are huge places of education, and people from all over the world attend them. So the third one is cultural globalization, so cultural aspects have spread from place to place, such as, handshakes, bowing your head down, saying nice to meet you. These sort of things have affected the way that our culture exists. And another big thing I want to talk about and I want to emphasize is globalization is not equal across the board. So globalization has started and continues to start in Europe and North America. And what I mean by that is even though India and Nigeria produce more films than the United States does, Hollywood is considered internationally as the pinnacle of filmmaking. So you go to almost any country in the world and you ask them to think about filmmaking, they're going to think of Hollywood. They're not going to think about Bollywood or Nollywood. Um, so, be, and this exists for a multitude of reasons. Historically, Hollywood has been there a bit longer in its international role. I don't know the history of filmmaking, but I would assume that Hollywood, sprang up in the 1940s, 50s, and spread then. Additionally, Hollywood has way more financial resources than India and Nigeria, and also like English-speaking films are generally more accepted than Hindi-speaking films or I'm trying to think what they speak. I used to know what they spoke in Nigeria. I think it's Yoruba, but correct me if I'm wrong. So yes, moving on. Mass media is a huge part of globalization, and not every country, has huge firms that deal with mass media. The United States is probably the leader in mass media. So Apple, Google, YouTube, they dominate global mass media. But we're seeing kind of the rise of Chinese and East Asian forms of mass media, which can be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, such as TikTok, Weibo, that sort of stuff. Globalization also takes the form of music and television. So K-pop, which originated in South Korea, is popular pretty much all over the world. Anime, which began in Japan, has spread all over the world. I've seen anime. Justin Bieber from Canada, Eurovision from the EU, Taylor Swift from the US, Turkish soap operas. Those are just a couple examples. There's probably thousands, if not millions. And now, kind of to talk about the history of globalization, the Bretton Woods Conference was a major, keystone recognition of globalization, and especially in terms of the economy. So it was also known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, and it happened in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the U.S. And there were 730 delegates from 44 allied nations after World War II, and it was used to regulate the global financial order, or regulate the global financial order following World War II. It was successful in forming an agreed-upon international monetary policy, as well as several key financial institutions, and we're going to kind of explore those. So, GATT and the WTO, among others. So, the GATT was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the goal was to remove tariffs and trade restrictions, so kind of promote free trade. This evolved into the World Trade Organization, which succeeded GATT, and it formalized resolving trade disputes and set up international trade policies. Additionally, the World Bank and IMF, which we kind of talked about a little bit, these are financial institutions powered by globalization, which took on roles overseen by GATT. So the WTO is still like the big mama, but the World Bank and IMF are they took on roles, so the WTO didn't have too much power, and it made it more efficient. Then there's the Maastricht Treaty, which allowed for increased European economic integration and kind of the establishment of the European Union, one of the largest, if not the largest, zone of economic prosperity. And then one of the more applicable to American politics, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which allowed for free trade between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So goals of GATT/WTO, I guess I should call WTO because that's what it is now. First one is free trade, no tariffs. Second is creation of free trade zones, which are areas with small or no tariffs. Third is reduced transportation costs of products. Sorry, I forgot a very crucial word. So increased production of container ships for shipping, which is pretty straightforward. Fourth is reduction/elimination of capital control. So capital control is, the control of money and the spreading of money. In 2015, Greece instituted capital control to prevent Greeks from taking out too much cash during a financial crisis, which would have resulted in banking collapses. So capital control can be good, can be bad. It depends on who's looking at it. Fifth one is reduction of or harmonization of subsidizations for small businesses. This one hasn't been as successful because there's still pretty much every country subsidizes small businesses. They want their small businesses to do well. 6 is provide subsidies for global corporations, which is something kind of We're seeing pushback against in recent times because we're seeing the rise of the corporation and its power, but that's what the WTO wants. That sounded like I was taking a jab at the WTO. I didn't mean for that. They really did want corporations to kind of be pillars of the global order. We're also seeing harmonization of intellectual property laws and supranational recognition of intellectual property. For example, a Chinese patent would or should, under the WTO's goal, be recognized in the United States. This doesn't happen as much, but we're kind of seeing debates about it exist, which is, I think, a good thing. All right, and one of the most important ones is cultural globalization. I think this one's the most interesting to me, and it's the spread of common cultural practices internationally. For example, McDonald's provides a similar, if not identical, food to people in the United States, China, India, France, Australia, and Brazil. So they're all kind of eating similar, if not the same foods. Even though this is like a trivial thing, you might be like, haha, how's food that important? It's something that connects us all globally. The spread of social norms to distant groups of people. For example, people in Japan wear Italian-produced fashion. French businessmen, or a French businessman shakes hands with an Iranian businesswoman. This is, cultural practices that are kind of, they didn't exist before globalization. Now they do, and it's a standard. And results in decreased uniqueness of cultural institutions. This is more of a negative, and it's a fear of loss of unique culture, which places many countries receiving cultural globalization, which comes from the EU and the US, and it's often called cultural colonization. So people say that colonization never died, it just turned into globalization. Now I want to talk about political globalization. So non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are organizations that operate not for a specific government, for a specific mission instead. So for example, PETA, Red Cross, Red Crescent, Greenpeace, these are all organizations that aren't limited to a government. They exist almost everywhere. These can also include supranational institutions such as G8, European Union, United Nations. These are institutions that involve multiple governments, all for a common goal. Political globalization can and is resisted with isolationist policies. So right now we're seeing North Korea be the ideal representation of this. It bans most international travel. It resists humanitarian aid from foreign countries on a large level. So North Korea, I guess, is the best example of this, even though I wouldn't say it's a perfect example because it still is connected on a global level. And then here are just some general debates on globalization. So here are the positives. So medicine, of course, we all love medicine for the most part. And global medical advancements have reduced infant mortality and increased life expectancy for most nations. This doesn't, not all nations receive this benefit because, money is a privilege, and a lot of European/North American countries do benefit from increased medicine, but it still affects every country. Transportation, so travel for the wealthy, is highly accessible. Poor people still don't have access to transportation globally, but it still does benefit the wealthy to a large extent. And then more efficient transportation available for developing countries, although less so. So even though poorer countries don't have access to the best personal transportation, they still have access to trains in India or Morocco, that sort of stuff. And then education, literacy increased from 53% to 74% from 1970 to 1998. This is amazing. It allows people to read, and that is such an important part of a positive life in our modern society. And some people argue that isn't due to globalization, but at least in part education is due to globalization due to technology and education initiatives. Here are some of the negatives. There's economic pitfalls. So outsourcing, it provides high income nations with cheap products from developing nations with low wages. So let's say Canada imports cell phones from Indonesia cheaply because Indonesia pays their workers very low salaries. And people would say this is, negative for Canada because Canadian phone companies that are like small scale or smaller firms, they're being harmed because they can't provide as cheap, you know, as cheap labor or whatever. So it harms like the Canadian worker and it harms the Canadian firm that doesn't outsource, and it also harms Indonesian workers. The second example is more of an extreme case. So Portugal imports iron ore from Zimbabwe because it's cheaper than importing it from a developed nation. Zimbabwe's iron ore miners often die from Zimbabwe's non-existent or non-enforced worker protection laws. So Portugal is literally profiting from the death of Zimbabwean workers. I'm like, that's not their goal, of course, but it still occurs. And then there's a huge amount of income disparity that we're seeing. So in developed countries, the wealthy are becoming more wealthy, whereas the middle class and working class aren't experiencing as much wage growth. So let's juxtapose the arguments between the two sides of globalization. So pro-globalization cite economic benefits, diplomatic peace, the spread of capitalism and democracy, usually, and increased GDP, usually. Anti-globalizers would say that globalization exploits developing nations and workers. It damages the environment on a large scale. It spreads imperialism/colonialism, and it destroys, unique cultures. So now I want to move on to globalization in the United States specifically. So globalization is super, super important in the US. It increases, or there's more increased markets. For example, Amazon, Google, and Apple are all, super huge corporations now, and they have more markets overseas and domestically. And new cultures, so we're seeing immigration, internet culture, new music forms being brought to the United States. And the question is, are these mostly positive or are they negative? And my answer is it's a mixed bag. So case study 1, free trade. So free trade, like I said before, is the trade between countries without taxes on imports, which are called tariffs. So liberals would argue that this spreads capitalism, can help spread democracy, and it establishes interdependence between two countries economically, which leads to a liberal order. Anti-arguments are, so the populist argument is it allows for developing countries like India, China, Brazil, etc. to produce products cheaper than American producers, harming businesses and workers. Well, it harms domestic businesses, not, the businesses that are actually outsourcing. And then the anti-argument is looking through the socialist lens. There's free trade results in worker exploitation, as it is a competition to have the lowest wages. So like I said, with Zimbabwe and Portugal, or Indonesia and Canada, it most of the time harms the workers in the developing country. So case study 2, outsourcing. Outsourcing is contracting a business operation to a different location. In this case, I want to refer to moving the business to a developing country, which happens typically but doesn't always happen like that. So the liberal argument is in support of this. It says outsourcing allows for Americans to buy goods at a cheaper price. So buying a TV is, cheaper than it would if the TV was solely produced in the U.S. And this is because developing countries can produce items cheaply. The populist argument would be against this. American workers lose their jobs when they're outsourced to other countries. So that one's pretty straightforward. Firms are always going to move to the place that produces things cheaper. So American workers would, of course, lose their jobs because the U.S. has pretty high salaries. And then the socialist argument is outsourcing damages poor countries by forcing them to rely on having cheap labor. So this is more of this is a humanitarian view through it, that the workers are dying or being poor or being paid very poorly, so that's not beneficial to them. So labor standards would never increase, hypothetically. And last big topic I want to talk about is Americanization. So this is the export of American culture to other nations. The United Nations in 2005 stated that while East Asia is increasing their cultural exports, Western Europe and the U.S. are still the leaders of culture and cultural exports. For example, Starbucks and McDonald's are the world's two largest food/beverage restaurants and have thousands of locations globally. So it's American businesses are practically literally everywhere besides, specific countries like North Korea, maybe to an extent Iran. Critics of Americanization believe it can damage domestic cultures and force them to become Americanized. So, an example of this is post World War II, Europe received massive American investment, and there was a large resentment of American culture due to the European cultures felt they were being infringed upon and began to resent American and English influence. And last thing I want to talk about is immigration and population changes. So American population drastically increased from 1900 to 2000, tripled from 76 million to 281 million in 2000. And this is important because obviously there's a massive population growth, and over half of the children under the age of 1 in the United States belong to a quote-unquote minority group. How will this affect the U.S.'s national identity in the future, racially, ethnically, etc.? Because, the United States kind of views itself as being a white nation. How will this, affect that? Will it cause the United States to reevaluate itself? Will it result in more diverse political adventures, or ventures? I'm not sure. And then instead of immigrants coming from Europe, immigrants now come from other nations that are usually like non-white. So Mexico, China, Philippines, India, Cuba, Colombia, Dominican Republic, those are the largest countries, or the countries that send the most immigrants to the United States. These are non-white nations. How will this affect American politics? That's not up for me to decide. But yes, I hope you enjoyed my little rundown on globalization, and it was a good introduction to globalization and how it affects the United States.